Joining me is Alexander Downer, Australia's longest-serving foreign minister, in my opinion, the best. Alexander Downer, thank you for your time. You dealt with China a lot 15, 20 years ago. How much more dangerous is it now?
Oh, I think it's fundamentally changed. I think it's become a great deal more dangerous. The China of Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin was problematic enough for us, and I could quote you chapter and verse of problems we did have with them, but we did have a modus vivendi. But I'd have to say, under Xi Jinping, China has become very aggressive. Like a lot of rising powers through history, as their power increases, so their arrogance increases, and they've now started to overplay their hand. I mean, the interview that I just saw then from the 7:30 report with the Chinese ambassador demonstrates extraordinary insensitivity to the Australian public and public opinion in Australia to speak like that and behave like that. I mean, it just shows you the regime is completely out of touch with most of the rest of the world.
It's funny, isn't it? I mean, you have talked to so many diplomats and ambassadors in particular in the past. I know they've got to lie for their country. But to do it with such effrontery, such shamelessness, and such brazenness, how many have you come across like that?
Well, he's doing that just from the talking points that have been sent to him from Beijing, so I wouldn't personalise the lying. I would say that it is very much the strategy of the regime to just try to put a spin on things and think that that's going to satisfy most of the rest of the world. I mean, it's absurd that looking at the interview and thinking about the arguments he makes that the people of Taiwan, 23 million people, have to be punished and re-educated. I mean, have they thought through even for 5 minutes what effect saying that is going to have on public opinion? What it does for the image of China, the regime of China, in the rest of the world. I mean, it's so damaging to the image of the country. You do expect, whatever you say about diplomats, you do expect them to put the country's best foot forward, try to persuade people to see things your way. Very poor diplomacy, but then Chinese diplomacy, the People's Republic of China's diplomacy over the last 5 or 6 years has been a very classic model of what not to do.
I think that's because they're trying to please their masters in Beijing rather than persuade anyone over here. I think they've got a completely different audience. The nature of this regime, I think, was exposed by another lie that the ambassador told last night about Australian journalist Chang Lei, who's been in jail in China for 2 years on unproved and implausible charges of passing on state secrets. She's even unable to talk to her 2 children in Australia. Here is the ambassador.
Well, Chen Li's case is very special in the sense that she's in charge of transmitting national security information overseas.
That's the allegation against her.
That's the truth.
Alexander Downer, that's the ambassador insisting Chang Lei is guilty when there's in fact been no finding even by a Chinese kangaroo court yet. The Albanese government has said almost nothing publicly about Chang Lei. What should it be doing to free her? Should we just put up with quiet diplomacy like this?
Well, first of all, how would she have had access to confidential secret security information, which in turn she was transmitting overseas? So she's a journalist. So the proposition is just completely absurd. It's not as though she was working for the Chinese government or working for their intelligence services or anything. So the allegation is completely absurd. I mean, the Australian government's position is difficult because they can continue to make representations. And, we have a consular agreement with China that they're supposed to give us access to Australian citizens who are held in detention there. But, China's government, the PRC government, the communist government, has become increasingly insensitive and arrogant, as we've been discussing, to the views of the rest of the world. So the government can do nothing more than continually make representations. But, a lot of the time, I know there's been some sort of vague reconciliation between the communists in China and the Australian government. That didn't last very long, but
No.
Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese and others need to try to engage with them as best they can. But you can't just spring the journalist out of jail, of course. It's not possible.
No, I got that. But I mean, at least make them pay some price in public opinion, in their public reputation by saying something. It can't make it any worse, can't make it any better. At least then put a price on when they do this sort of thing. Just finally, Alexander Downer, the Solomon Islands to our northeast. Yeah, the Solomon Islands to our northeast, it's signed a secret defence deal with China. It's banned now American and British ships from docking there. It is now cancelling elections that were due next year, claiming it doesn't have the money for both the elections and holding next year's Pacific Games. The Albanese government's tried to get around that by offering to pay for those elections as well as the Games. But the Solomon Islands say, well, no, this is an assault on democracy and an interference in its politics. We have now the Solomon Islands Prime Minister apparently trying to create a Cuba in the Pacific just off our borders, but our Prime Minister still refuses to say a word of criticism. Here he is today.
Oh, look, we want a good relation with our Pacific neighbours, and I'm very much looking forward to hosting Prime Minister Sogavare. I'll be hosting him at the Lodge for dinner in just a few weeks' time in October.
I know that Albanese was very critical of so-called megaphone diplomacy by the previous government, but isn't there a happy medium where you can actually say you're in favour of democracy in the Pacific?
Well, I think the problem here is a bit historic. The Australian government hasn't done enough over quite some period of time in relation to Prime Minister Sogavare. Look, believe me, I know this guy. He was the Prime Minister when I was the Foreign Minister, and we had a very bad run-in over a couple of issues. And one of them was he wanted to kick the regional assistance mission led by Australia out of the Solomon Islands altogether, which would have set the country back into chaos. And I refused to do that. And you can say that was arrogant and undemocratic or whatever. But I wanted to make sure that country remained stable, and I didn't want Sogavare destabilizing it. So, I basically ran a campaign with the Solomon Islands people and talked to the people through the Solomon Islands media. I think that, so this would be the advice I'd give the Australian government today. Out there in the Solomon Islands, the average person is very sympathetic to Australia, and they'll have much more of an identity with Australia than they would with a country like China. But we need to communicate with the public there much more than we do. So I think Penny Wong, Anthony Albanese, Richard Marles and so on, the relevant ministers, they need to be having a conversation with the people of the Solomon Islands. So angry did they become, the public become, with Sogavare when I was the Foreign Minister, the Parliament overthrew him as Prime Minister. And that honestly was a very good result. But, we've done nothing since he's come back. And he, as you say, threatens to turn Solomon Islands into a Cuba for Australia. And honestly, we cannot allow that to happen.
We've got to use our weapons, which, as you say, is public opinion in the Solomons. But if you don't encourage the opposition to Sogavare, if you don't encourage people to see us as their friend and on their side, you are going to lose. You are going to lose. You're giving away your weapons. But they don't want to admit that the Morrison government was right not to trust this bloke. That's what the real problem is politics. Alexander Downer, thank you so much for your time.